I'm Teresa Beanken, CEO of National Speakers Bureau Canada and Global Speakers Agency. We're one of the original speakers bureaus in North America, and we envision that the sharing of ideas inspires action to make the world a better place. They're bringing you expert speakers and thought leaders for your conferences, training sessions, or program events, whether they are in person, online, or hybrid. And on the heels of the election results and many workplaces back in office, we thought today's topic was timely. So I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker. Linda Nazareth is an accomplished economist futurist, the Senior Fellow for Economics and Population Change at policy think tank, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. She's an expert in demographic, workplace, and economic trends and how they will shape our future. She recently launched her podcast, Work in the Future, and in 2021, she's focused on her work with trends changing the post-pandemic economy. Linda's authored a number of books, including her latest, Work is Not a Place, Our Lives and Organization in the Post-Jobs Economy, where she engages people in thinking about what the world might look like when we replace the idea of jobs with that of work, and why that might not be a bad idea at all. Her book, Economorphics, The Trends Turning Today into Tomorrow, actually started as a presentation to companies to help them with their strategic planning. And her clients have included everyone from American Express through to The Economist magazine, and all have benefited from her ability to take big ideas and distill them into information they can use for their own strategic plans. Prior to this, Linda was the Senior Economic Analyst for Business News Network, BNN, and Canada's only full-time on-air economist for over a decade, as well as a senior economist with the top 5 bank and with the federal government. Welcome, Linda.
Hi, Teresa. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to everyone today. It's an exciting time. It is a time of change, and I think it's a time when our workforce and the way we work and how we work is changing so quickly that it's hard to have a handle on it, but we do need to have a handle on it. So let's talk about why work is not a place. You know, this is a topic I am passionate about. As Teresa said, I have had different roles as an economist, worked on Bay Street and talked about financial markets and all kinds of things. But to me, it comes down to who we are, how we work. And even before the pandemic, I wrote the book before the pandemic, it was clear to me we were in a different place because technology had opened things up for us, demographics was changing, climate change was an issue, everything was coming together, and that was going to change how we work. We are really very much at an inflection point. And I'll talk about this in the context of history. You know, once upon a time, work was just about making a living. You farmed to live, and that was about it. Then we moved to this kind of gig economy. We were out there maybe as blacksmiths or millers or textile workers, and everyone had a trade. It's kind of the next phase of it. And then factories, and that was a real switch. When we got to the point where we were talking about working in factories, it was about having to go to work to use the tools. And eventually, you know, that moved into typewriters and being in an office setting and being all together doing that. And there's an economist called Ronald Coase. He won a Nobel Prize because he asked this question: why do companies pay for people to come together and work? It makes no sense, right? You're paying them to be there all year. You may only need them for part of that time. Why do we do this? And he came to the conclusion that we did that because the transactions costs of bringing people together just as you needed them were too high. But you know what? The transactions costs have gone down now. You can use your phone to call people in. So you can still bring them together in an office and you can have them as workers, but you can do things a lot of different ways. And that is why one of the reasons why I said this is an inflection point and we can choose. Now, the reason why I think we are going to choose to do things different ways, there's several, but one is that we are in the shadow of this pandemic. And yeah, it's going to be a long shadow because the pandemic was where we were all heroic and we rose to the occasion and companies did what they had to and governments did what they had to. But you know what? It's going to weigh on growth for a long time. as an economist, I have to look at this and say, well, this comes from the International Monetary Fund. This is growth rates, potential growth rates for the next couple of years. If you look at 22, 23, you see those yellow lines? That shows the range of growth we could get. I think with Delta, we're on the lower end of that. That means companies are trying to figure out how to be profitable in the midst of a lot of turmoil. And here's another graph to look at. This is federal debt that we have to pay as a percentage of gross domestic product. It was pretty low before the pandemic. It means our taxes could have been low. It's gone very high, and it's going to take a while to come down. And we know what happens when you try and get debt down. Somebody pays for it. It's probably business taxes as well as cuts in services down the line. We're not talking about that yet, but we will. So when you go through that transition, other things have to change too. And I think that will include how we work and how companies organize that. Another major thing is demographics. I've talked about this a long time, but it's more important than ever. Demographics, the aging population, the fact that our society doesn't look the way that it did 10 years ago and that it will look very different in future. Let's just remind ourselves what the population looks like right now. Population pyramid shows men and women on each side here by percentage, age by percentage here. And you can see the baby boom bulge near the big top here. You can see the millennial bulge, smaller. They're in their 20s into 30s. The boomers are from their late 50s into their early 70s, and there's a gap between. Let's go 10 years into the future. It looks different, right? It's skinnier, almost a flat line. And here it is 20 years in the future, different again. What matters here is that you have a society that is older, that will buy different things, will have different needs in terms of housing. We won't have the same number of people streaming into the labor force to look for work. We know that overall, a younger society is one that is out buying more things and is more likely to be working for pay in the labor force than is an older one. And an older one is just going to grow somewhat slower. So that's the first thing. You have to make up for that loss of organic growth. You have to make up for the fact that you don't have a bunch of cheap workers. I mean, this was great for China 20 years ago. They had all these people coming from the country into cities to work in factories, just huge numbers of young people. They don't have that anymore. And we don't have that anymore too, for good and bad. I mean, if we were a society with a lot of younger people, it would have been more painful during the pandemic. The unemployment rate would have been higher. Right now, you are seeing shortages of workers. It's partly demographic driven. All of the younger workers that should have been working in restaurants aren't there the same way. So it's influencing us now. It influences us more in future in terms of our competitive position. Okay, let's just remind ourselves what it looked like in terms of Canada right now. Here's the Philippines, completely different shape. Here's India, completely different shape. These are younger societies, and it gives them some kind of advantage. And if we are competing internationally, it's something organizations will have to shuffle around and be ready for. So it'll be a time where we have to adjust, and that will impact everything. Another major part of this, the complement to demographics, is the fact that this is a time when technology is changing very quickly. It's very much the fourth industrial revolution. Industry 4.0, the fourth industrial revolution. It's cool. It means we have these robots. It means our toasters talk and we can talk to each other without being in the same room. And these are great things. But in terms of how it changes work and in terms of how it changes, well, really everything, there are huge considerations. Again, let's pop this into history. We've had 4 industrial revolutions so far. The first one was in the late 1700s. That one gave us the steam engine and the weaving loom. About 100 years later, we got the second industrial revolution, mass production, the assembly line, energy. And then for about the 1960s, we've had a different one. This has been the one that has given us digital power. It's given us computers. Started with space programs, and we know how it's progressed since then. It's been great. Now we've got to this fourth industrial revolution, which is one that's moving very, very quickly. We're talking about cyber physical systems, the Internet of Things, networks. It's giving us unintended consequences. You can load up your DNA and think that you're just going to find a long lost cousin, and it turns out you may be related to a serial killer. That's a real example. They found the Golden State Killer in California because of exactly that. So we've kind of opened this Pandora's box. And again, it's moving much more quickly than it might have had it not been for the pandemic. I sometimes use the example of David's bridal. It's a bridal store. It had very basic technology. But during the pandemic, they moved up so quickly to use chatbots and distribution systems and use labor in different ways. And they're probably not going back. It was Microsoft who used the term 2 years and 2 months, because in the first couple of months of the pandemic, they saw things they had not expected to see in terms of utilization of technology. Now, there's obviously huge work implications here. We are talking about potentially seeing job losses. We're only in wave one of this. This is according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, where we've seen some adjustment in terms of jobs. Wave two, in 5, 6, 7 years, we're going to see much quicker changes, and then after that, even quicker. So, we're on the cusp of this. We think we are seeing the future now, but we're really not. When you see that there's shortages of workers, don't get complacent. This is a very early stages, and we will be in a very different place in 10 years. And a lot of people are going to be vulnerable to that. According to Statistics Canada, it's those with the least education that are the most vulnerable. Those who have more education, who are paid more, are less at a risk of automation taking their jobs. They look at it, again, in terms of automation, in terms of education, as well as in terms of income. I would dispute this. I think everybody is at risk of seeing their jobs change, if not disappear. We are talking about some new jobs coming in. And we are also talking about the fact that we need technology, because if you can't find people to staff your restaurant, you have to go a different way. And it may not be very long until you see this. They're trying this out in places like Japan. But again, we can't underestimate how much technology is going to change things in future. Yes, we may all be influencers making a ton of money. We are certainly going to see new jobs, but we can't avoid the fact that there's going to be change. Another thing we can't avoid is that climate change is going to be an issue. I've done presentations for so many years now. I used to not talk about climate change necessarily because, economist wasn't necessarily my topic. It was just something that was happening. Well, now I talk about it every time because it influences every industry. When Walmart puts out a quarterly report, they mention climate change because it could potentially mean flooding. When I talk to real estate, it's like, you have to talk about this because you're seeing valuations change in real estate in Florida, and you're going to see valuations change everywhere. You're going to see climate risk being part of every industry. And, it's something that we have kind of gotten to see firsthand this summer with wildfires and floods. And every industry, as I said, is going to be impacted. I spoke recently to Orchestras Canada, and you wouldn't think they'd be concerned about this, but they are. Because if you take a 45-person orchestra and put them on a plane to go somewhere, well, that's a big carbon footprint. They're thinking about that. When you fly in a conductor, that's an issue. When you put together a performance space, it's something you need to think about. So if you're taking that consideration every time, it will certainly influence work. It will certainly influence in years coming how you hire, where you put people, where you decide to have people working physically, and how those offices look like. So, we're not turning the corner on this. At the beginning of the pandemic, when everybody was at home, we saw air quality go up just substantially. We know this is in the major cities of the world, Rome, Madrid, the concentration just changed so dramatically. We know that when we don't have as many people on the roads, we have fewer people die every morning, because if you're all trying to get to work at the same time, that's an issue. And, again, too, I think we've seen governments step up and treat this pandemic like an emergency. And there's increasingly voices to say climate change is an emergency too. So that won't go away. So you put them all together and you have a work revolution. I like to use the word kaleidoscope because I think what's happening with work is we have moved from something that was pretty stable, everybody going to work every day, maybe being there for years at a time, 40 hours a week. And that was okay. So all our policies were around that, whether we were talking about banks lending, whether we were talking about where people lived, we knew it was stable. But it's changing. And I make the comparison with families that it used to be the family was one thing. It was mom and dad and the kids. And if you were selling a product, it was cereal or Coca Cola, you understood this market and you were fine. But now, it's a lot of different markets. You're not just selling to that traditional family, you're selling to empty nesters and people who don't have children and very untraditional forms of family life. And I think it'll be very much the same for work. And we have to get ready for this in terms of management and policy and everything else. And, we talk about hybrid as the top of this. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just in terms of managing that, what skills are you going to reward? Being good on video conference is not necessarily as the same thing as being good in the office. It's a different set of skills. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. What about the fact that we've built these cities to have offices and skyscrapers and people buying things there? What about if they're not there anymore to buy the coffee and the sandwiches? Deutsche Bank has said you need to impose a tax on these companies because they changed the game plan. They were supposed to be there and now they're not supporting the tax structure. I don't think that'll happen, but I think we have to get our minds around the fact we're going to have this kind of Hollywood model where maybe people come together to do projects as workers or maybe as casual workers, as gig workers. Now, in Hollywood, you have actors working sporadically, but you also have these guys, the guys who work at tech and the makeup artists and the like, and they've all figured it out. So I think this will be part of the future for sure. So, we'll have different kinds of gigs, the ones at Uber, but also the highly paid tech workers who are happy to do this. Side hustles will be a part of our reality going forward. You're probably asking, why are we seeing the Queen as a young woman there? Because the Queen has always had a side hustle. Despite being monarch, she also had an interest in stud farms, horse races, and she's made a considerable amount of money over her reign doing that. Well, maybe other people will do that. I think they will. I think when we look at the next generation of workers, it won't be one thing. It'll be lots of different things. So you're going to have to manage that differently. And yeah, you're going to have superstars. You can choose whether they want to work in an office or how many months a year, and you're going to have people at the other side of that who are kind of at the mercy of what happens. As leaders, as managers, you're going to be figuring this out. When I speak to companies, organizations, I always tailor my remarks to what they're doing, but I often speak to financial services and say, how are you going to lend in the midst of this? Because you're not going to look for pay stubs the same way you did. As management, as government, actually, you're going to think about basic incomes, perhaps, or support programs. There's certainly policies that are not about, being workers the same way. What about casual workers? What kind of benefits do they get? We have retro policies for what the world we have right now. And yeah, as managers in companies, people are going to be doing constant curation, saying, do we keep this person? Do we retrain this person? Do we let them go? Or do we change our structure altogether and have casual workers as opposed to employees? Do we stop saying employees and start saying workers? And if you have that, how do you manage that? How do you keep in touch with this flexible workforce that's out there that you want in and that you have to still keep in contact with? We don't have those skills. The retraining is an important part of this, the reskilling. AT&T, great example of this. As a company, they looked at things and said, do we want to have a shortage of workers or do we want to retrain the people we have with new skills? They said they're going to go ahead and retrain. They were partway through that process, supposedly going well. Amazon, not always a popular company, but they are a company that is really into the thick of retraining, trying to get enough software skills. Disney, also a good example of this. You can be Elsa riding the float there and then decide you're going to be retrained and do something else. And Disney will help you with that and keep you in the company. So it'll be long range plans and it'll be a different future, but it'll be an interesting moment as we go forth into this because, it's not the same role for management. It's a different role, but we have to embrace it because nothing's going to go backwards. So yes, we have very much a new world going forward. I've shown you a lot of graphs. I'm going to show you one more. And this relates to the pandemic or natural disasters, where you have a period beforehand, and this is done by psychologists, where it's your feelings go down, and then you have a heroic period where everybody kind of rises to the occasion. Then you get disillusioned, and then you eventually get to the point where you rebuild, and you can create what you want when you rebuild. And I'm going to leave you with the thought that this is a moment where we are rebuilding the workforce, we're rebuilding how we work, and we can make decisions now that take us forward in terms of competitiveness of our own companies, but also of the broader economy. So it's a real opportunity, and I'm optimistic about it, but it'll be an exciting time and a challenging one. Thank you. Teresa.
Thank you, Linda. Much appreciated. And especially right there at the end where you talked about we are in this rebuilding phase, because it certainly feels that way. And even seeing that on the chart, I think helps us all identify with what we've probably all been going through in the last year and a bit.
Absolutely.
We
Interesting
are
times.
able to, I guess, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's interesting times.
Mhm. We are able to take a few questions before the end of the session, and so feel free to add those into the Q&A. I do see there's a question from Suzanne wondering about your reference to side hustles. And can you explain a few more examples of what that might be? She's wondering, for example, is that like social selling, multi-level marketing?
Well, it can be any of it. I mean, a side hustle could be Uber. It could be the fact that you can sit here in Toronto or wherever you are and come up with a product that you want to sell. You have it manufactured in China, you put it on Amazon, and the world opens up to you. I mean, there's a site called Teachers Pay Teachers where you can take your lesson plan and sell it to some other teacher. I looked at this, I looked at Lord of the Rings, a book I remember from school, and there's games, there's lesson plans, there's quizzes. Teachers supposedly have made hundreds of thousands of dollars. It sounds like a high number, but in the US, supposedly huge amounts of money selling to others, which I think is interesting because that was a very stable salary as a teacher. And because of technology, some have found ways to kind of open it up. So there are all kinds of side hustles. Some really hate this and say, look, this is government abdicating things. Because you have these platforms and people can get a little extra money easily, you don't have to have the same social services. But you know what? I don't think it's going away. And I think especially for younger people, don't know that we'll always just do one job. I think there'll always be a lot of things that you can do and you will do.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that. We have another question from Trish. You talked a good amount about leadership, and she's wondering what questions should leaders be asking about the workplace of the future to be ahead of the pack?
Yeah, that's an interesting one because I mean, obviously, the most important thing is how can you be profitable? How can you be there for shareholders and get yourself in the right place? But I think there's broader questions too. Where do we want to be as a country, and where do you want this industry to go? And there's social questions. But it comes down to you need the right talent to go forward. And I think many companies don't have the right talent. So you have to figure it out. Say, are we going to retrain them? Are we going to put in our own training programs? And you've seen that. Like you've seen some companies. Well, obviously the Googles have to do a lot of this, but also Singapore Airlines is doing some. And then decide how much do you want in terms of people on staff, because the option will be there to have the team part of this or the casual workers. Can I make that work, or should I have the workers? And if I have them, can I manage properly? I mean, just the pandemic, we've seen everyone have to figure out how to manage something really different. And I think this will be kind of like the pandemic. The next phase of work will be where companies have to figure out very different things. So I'd say in terms of what you should do, you have the conversation now, have the strategic plan now, maybe have scenario planning now, and look at different ways to do this.
Great, thank you. And about strategic planning or scenario planning, because things are moving so quickly, what's your sense about how far into the future are organizations trying to plan?
Should try to plan or
Hmm.
yeah, I would think it's a good. I mean, it's obviously difficult because if you had a plan for this year, it probably looks really different, right? But the long-term planning is easier than short-term planning. It's hard to say what's going to happen next year, but if you look over 5 years or 10 years, you have a pretty good idea how tech is going to change things, and you can certainly know how demographics are going to change things because those numbers are there for you. So I would definitely urge companies to have a 5 year or 10 year plan, and climate change too, and look at all of those things. And it's really hard in the moment because we are trying to be heroic and deal with these things that are being thrown at us. But the companies that do well and the industries that do well, I think, are the ones that do have the strategic plans in place.
Thank you. Thanks. And you covered training and upskilling. And there's a question from Aaron wondering about for younger people, do you see training in technology as one of the best bets for the future?
You know what? I do, of course, and we all have to be technologically savvy. But if you look at the traits that you really need going forward, it's kind of emotional intelligence, ability to pivot, tenacity. World Economic Forum has a long list of them, but it's not just the actual skills, it's the ability to do a lot of different things. So it'll be the people who do well will not necessarily just be the tech experts. It'll be the people who have a lot of skills and creativity and are able to think well and implement things well, which is a kind of fuzzy answer, but it's actually a fuzzy future in terms of this.
Right. A lot of those essential skills will be important.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for this, Linda. I really appreciate the combination of the really current data and information with the insights that go along with it and the mindset that organizations should be keeping into account, especially from a leadership and manager organization with a lot of the specific examples. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
It's been really great to have you, as well as everyone who's attended with us today. We will send a recording to those who have registered. And as mentioned, we've got thank you to Linda for providing a downloadable copy of her latest book. So we'll make that available here and in the follow up email. And as I touched on off the top, we are here every 2 weeks to bring you some new content, great speaker ideas to help you both personally and professionally. And we look forward to seeing everyone again soon. Thanks all.